Hello, I'm Janice Karen, the Director of Policy, Technology, and Innovation at the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, or MHDC. I run our Data Governance Collaborative, also known as the DGC. We start each of our weekly meetings with a series of industry quick updates to learn about new and proposed regulations, laws, standards, industry initiatives, and other activity. Join us for this week's updates. If you'll go to the first update, thank you. So the first thing that we have is that ONC put out a brief about the feasibility of using clinical decision support with SDOH data. However, a lot of the content is not SDOH specific. They do point out some things that are, such as that some of the SDOH factors like housing instability and food insecurity are starting to show up in clinical guidelines, not SDOH specific things, but in guidelines for other conditions and other things to look out for. So they also mentioned that starting with version 2, US CDI and the related US core implementation guides contain SDOH data. So data availability is becoming more prevalent. CDS provides a mechanism for presenting guidelines specifically relevant to actions that are being taken at the time they're taken, typically by integration with EHRs, but there are other methods, and some of the tools that are used to do that are things like CQL, CDS hooks, the Fire Clinical Guidelines Implementation Guide, Smart on Fire, and other things. We've talked about all of the ones I just mentioned here before, but there are definitely other mechanisms, but CDS hooks, Smart on Fire, all of the four that are here are probably the most commonly used things. They talked about evaluating individual guidelines for the return on investment for using CDS. And that was kind of an interesting section because it's not something we necessarily talk about specifically in a lot of detail a lot of the time. The return on investment on going electronic and more automated versus doing things. I mean, we talk about it in a general sense of we think it reduces the burden, but actually looking at measuring that isn't something that that is necessarily done a lot. So that was kind of interesting. And then the other piece of it, again, a lot of this was not SDOH specific, even, but they had an appendix where they list a bunch of guidelines that have some SDOH considerations that you could possibly use this to evaluate. So you can find the brief at that link. It was interesting. It wasn't what I expected based on the way it was advertised, but it was still an interesting read. It's very short. It doesn't go into a ton of detail. And if you've been with us when we've talked about things like CDS hooks or the Fire Clinical Guidelines IG or CQL or any of those pieces, and CQL is also used in a lot of quality measures, so that you also may have familiarity from that perspective. There isn't a ton of necessarily new stuff, but it was still an interesting read and I recommend it. Any thoughts, comments, questions there?
Yeah, Janice, what are some of the considerations for ROI?
I knew you were going to ask that. And I was actually just thinking when I was saying that, I don't remember what they are off the top of my head. I just remember they were interesting. But I'm going to pull it up real quick.
You save clinical expense by using decision support systems, or what?
I'm sorry, I was having some trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I can chime in on that one, Janice.
Okay, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, I think what it is, John, is what you're describing is where an individual, let's say clinical or social determinant condition or situation might determine whether using clinical decision support in those circumstances is helpful from a financial perspective, is what I think they're alluding to. So for example, if somebody has an SDOH factor that says, housing instability or whatever it might be, that if there's a clinical decision support trigger for that says if somebody is reporting housing instability, then, offer suggestions for alternative housing options, whatever the clinical decision support criteria might be. So I think
yeah,
that's
it's more, I've just taken a really quick look And it's more, they do it a lot more by example than actually talking about them in detail, but it's more like they look at the value. So if this guideline were to be applied more evenly and in every case where it's applicable, because part of the idea of doing it through CDS is that it's not applied by chance, but that you get notified when you should consider this guideline. So for instance, there might be a high value if it's something that people may not recognize on their own, but that may come up, or if it's something that they can't make changes on their own, but they need assistance for instance, if there's obesity is a factor that they're considering in a guideline, there may be some healthy food availability issues that they want to address. And that may be so they look at value, then they look at effort, what they have to look for in terms of to see if someone qualifies and how feasible it is to have all that, whether all of that data is likely to be available for all of the patients. And then what can be offered? Is there a good delivery mechanism for presenting it to the clinician? Are there programs that can be offered that will help with that, ameliorate that condition, et cetera. So it's kind of like a 4-step thing where they look at that value, effort, feasibility, and delivery mechanism, and make it have that framework for evaluating each guideline and whether it makes sense to go ahead and translate that into some type of clinical decision support. Does that help?
Yes, that is interesting.
So, and they use an example of the obesity case, so that was why that came up. I was looking at that while I was talking to you. So it is an interesting take on it. It's very short. It doesn't go into enough detail. It's not as SDOH focused as it should be given the title, but I still highly recommend it. Any further comments or thoughts or questions there? All right, moving on to the next one. So CMMI, which is the group at CMS that looks at value-based care and potential alternate payment models and evaluates their feasibility, is looking at 3 new alternate payment models to test. This is in response to a recent executive order related to trying to lower the cost of prescription medication. Excuse me. So there are 3 new alternate payment models that they're looking at testing. One of them is specific to Medicare Part D, and there's something they're calling the Medicare High Value Drug List, which implements fixed co-payments across all cost-sharing phases instead of going through the traditional, pay a percentage, then you have the donut hole, then you're covered kind of mechanism for specific generic drugs. So that's one model. They're also looking at having for cell and gene therapy access, a multi-state agreement whereby everyone in those states have a combined coordination and administration of therapies via the manufacturer rather than having it all controlled by CMS. So that's kind of an interesting take because that involves more wider standardization, which, as you probably can guess, I'm for, and it'll be interesting to see if that's something that works. And then the last one is around approving drugs that are have accelerated approval, and they have an alternate payment model, which is trying to encourage the post-approval research that's supposed to be required for drugs that go through this process. For those of you who aren't familiar, this accelerated approval process bypasses some of the required testing, as long as some of the effectiveness testing, they still require the is it safe type testing, and they still require some efficacy testing, but it's not as robust as going for full approval. And then the requirement is that you complete the testing and do additional testing based on real world usage after the approval. And there's been a real problem with getting that post-approval data in effectively in a timely manner, getting enough of it, et cetera. Those post-approval agreements have not been working well. And so I think this model is kind of an attempt to make that be effective so that those drugs can remain on the market and they can continue having a viable accelerated approval drugs, and also allow them to be used with CMS plans, because a lot of them a lot of the accelerated approval drugs are not necessarily taken up by Medicare or Medicaid or CHIP or some of the other programs. I think everyone probably heard about the Alzheimer's drug last year from Biogen, adalimumab, okay, whatever it's called, ADUL something, where they ran into a lot of problems. Medicare didn't accept it as an approved drug, and there were all kinds of issues around that. That drug was in this program. And so I think the idea here is to kind of shore that up and try to turn that into something that's workable and to ensure that the data collection happens. Any comments, thoughts, questions here? All right, moving on. The last one for today. CMS has also released a new fact sheet around Medicare prescription drug inflation rebate, which was part of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's both interesting because since it's not really a regulation, it didn't have a formal process of getting comments and then a final approval. So this document is actually kind of serving both as guidance and as request for comment. The comments are due in a couple of weeks on March 11th. And it talks about basically when the idea here is that when the cost of a drug increases faster than the rate of inflation, that there's a penalty. The manufacturer has to pay CMS money, and then that money gets reflected back to the people who use that drug. And so they basically make an adjustment to the coinsurance for those medications. And this starts April 1st of this year. There were a lot of things that they sort of generically laid out, but they were asking for comments on how the details should work on things like how to calculate the rebates, what types of operational considerations this would involve for Medicare Advantage, and there's a process for waiving the rebate if there's a shortage of a drug. I don't know if anyone else has encountered this. I certainly have, but over the last year in particular, there have been a lot of supply chain issues around prescription medication. And so I think the idea here is if there are supply issues, then they would suspend this program for those drugs to try to not make those worse. Any comments or thoughts there?
This is, I was just going to say, this is curious and welcomed, but the rate of specialty pharmacy always increases much higher than the rate of inflation. So I think it's terrific, but I'm just wondering, why now, I guess, or.
Well, because it was part of they finally got it passed, basically, is my take on it. As part of the Inflation Reduction Act, they did a lot of medication price things, and some of them they weren't able to get passed. Like, we all know that the one they publicized obviously is the price of insulin, that they were only able to cap it for people who were on Medicare and Medicaid and not for everyone. But there were a lot of other clauses there that were related to trying to keep the price of medication low. Like, for instance, we've talked about before the program where they're allowed to start negotiating prices for a limited number of drugs that increases every year for the next couple of years. And this is another one that didn't get a lot of attention. And again, it's clear that they don't yet have all of the details worked out. And it's not clear when something is going to be rebated, how that co-insurance adjustment happens. For instance, I assume that's part of what they were looking for in terms of under operational considerations for Medicare Advantage, was how that type of process would work. It's not clear to me that you would necessarily, the whole concept of a rebate is that it's retroactive.
Right.
So it's not clear, so there may be cases where you know, so it's not a simple, straightforward thing, but I think that the real answer to the why now is that they were able to get it passed.
I see. That's great. And I think the operational consideration for Medicare Advantage, I didn't work in that product, but rather in commercial. But if it can just be adjusted to the appropriate price on the fee schedule, that would be the simplest way to do it. If there's a fee schedule or sort of like set rates that CMS has for certain drugs, that would be the simplest way to do it. I'd love to say the process for waiving the rebate should just be not put in, but I appreciate that there has to be concession for difficult times, but I sort of feel like they can.
Yeah, I mean,
that'd be another suggestion.
That last one, I mean, that to some extent, on one hand, you don't want the shortages. On the other hand, it almost sounds like price gouging, right? We're going to allow you to have the higher price if there's a shortage of the drug.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, as far as what they can know in advance and what they can put in the fee schedule versus having some type of retroactive process, that part isn't at all clear to me. So it's not clear to me, except like I said, just the idea, the concept that it's a rebate and the fact that inflation changes and you don't necessarily know what it's going to be at any given time. So if you're if you're planning to increase the price of a drug by $100 on, let's say on May 1st, you don't necessarily know what the inflation is going to be on May 1st. So if you have a $300 drug debt and you're raising it 25%, it's almost certainly going to be over the rate of inflation. But if you have a $1,000 drug and you're raising it $100, maybe not, right? And if you have a $1,500 drug and you're raising it 100, that becomes even more iffy. So I think that how that actually all works out is not clear to me at this point in time. I don't think it's clear to them. I think that's why they really were, I would say, a good half, if not even more. And again, I haven't looked at it in a couple of days, but there certainly were a lot of, I think the request for comment part here is a very serious component of this release. And I think they're actively looking for people to suggest to them the best ways to implement these things. And they're not sure at this point what they are. Any other last comments or thoughts? All right, then if you'll go to the next slide and pause there for a second. Thank you, everyone. I hope you learned a lot from our quick updates. If you're interested in finding out more about the DGC and its other activities, email me at dgc@mahealthdata.org. That email address is also on your screen. And have a great week, everyone.